Good morning. My name is Warren Porter. I'm a professor of zoology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I am your chair for this next session, which is emerging science. We have two professors who are specializing in various aspects of genetics, and we're going to hear from the first one, Stella Koutros. She's a PhD investigator with the National Cancer Center Institute and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She leads several projects within the agricultural health study to investigate the role of occupational, environmental, and genetic risk factors for cancer. In particular, she's involved in a project to determine the impact of pesticide exposure on cancer risk. Dr. Koutros received her MPH and PhD in epidemiology at Yale and her BA from Tufts with a focus on epidemiology and public health. Dr. Koutros.
Hi. Thank you for having me. So my name is Stella Koutros, and I'm an epidemiologist at the National Cancer Institute. And we had a little bit of an intro in the talk before about some epidemiologic research. But for those of you who don't know what epidemiology is, it's the study of the distribution and determinants of a disease on human populations. And in my case, I study pesticides as risk factors for cancer in a study of farmers called the Agricultural Health Study. Oh, thank you. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about farmers and pesticides and cancer, and then I'm going to dive into some of the main results from the Agricultural Health Study on cancer findings overall, and then a little bit of information on my personal research, which focuses on prostate cancer. So we know that farmers are healthier than the general population. It's physically demanding work, and just by virtue of being able to do that work, we know that they are healthy. They also have lower rates of tobacco and alcohol use than the general population, and high rates of physical activity associated with their work on the farm. And they're exposed to a wide variety of things on the farm, including animals and animal viruses, engine exhausts and other fuels, solvents, biologically active dusts, and of course, pesticides. So what do we actually really know about pesticides and cancer? Among groups who have evaluated the totality of evidence, the consensus about the carcinogenicity of specific chemicals in humans is limited to two things. One pesticide class is identified as a human carcinogen, and that's arsenical insecticides. And one pesticide contaminant, dioxin, is also classified as a human carcinogen. And as you've heard, the EPA also has these classification systems. And here I'm providing another classification system that we also often use in cancer research that is provided by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, which is a group run out of the World Health Organization. And they also make these assessments about the carcinogenicity of various chemicals. And they have actually also identified the application of non-arsenical insecticides as probable human carcinogens as well. But given that we have a lot of pesticides that are registered for use, the fact that we only know one or two things about their association with cancer is somewhat troubling. So this slide is just sort of a general overview of epidemiologic studies associated with pesticide exposure, and it also illustrates just the various types of epidemiologic studies that are conducted. So early epidemiologic studies on pesticides and cancer were these ecologic type studies and an example of that is where you would take maybe the percent of county farmland in a state and try to relate that to cancer rates from that state. So that's really interesting and has identified that farming might be associated with cancer, but that doesn't provide you information at the individual level about the group of people. After those kinds of studies, there were several incidence and mortality studies and studies of occupational groups, farmers in particular. These are really based on the job title designation, so just identifying that farmers have lower rates of some cancers and higher rates of other cancers. And then additional studies were aimed at improving this definition of farmers and trying to identify what specific chemicals, or pesticides rather, were associated with an increased risk of cancer. So there were case control studies that were identifying various chemical groups like herbicides or insecticides as risk factors for cancer. And there were a few that are also trying to identify specific chemicals, but there's really a limited body of evidence that's implicating specific chemicals, specific pesticides rather, with cancer. And the best kind of study that you can do in epidemiology is a prospective cohort study where you take a group of people and you follow them over time. And ideally, you'd like to know what specific pesticides they're using, and then we can see whether they are related to cancer. And that was really the birth of the agricultural health study many years ago, before my time. And some background about the study. Again, it's a prospective cohort of about 57,000 licensed pesticide applicators, and their spouses were also enrolled. They come from Iowa and North Carolina, and the major crops in Iowa are corn, soybeans, hay, and alfalfa. In North Carolina, there's also corn and soybean crops, but there's a little bit more of a varied crop profile in North Carolina compared to Iowa. Subjects were enrolled in the early to mid-90s, and of course the focus of the study was really to assess pesticide use. And the study also collected a whole slew of additional questions and information on other agricultural exposures, non-agricultural jobs, lifestyle factors, medications, medical conditions, dietary factors, to try to really assess the totality of risk factors related to cancer. And what we do is we link on a fairly regular basis to the state cancer registries and try and combine that information with all the exposure information that we have. So here's just some of the cohort characteristics. Right here I have the most of the people who were enrolled were private applicators. That's a fancy term for just farmers, because there are also other applicators who were enrolled, people who worked in pest control operations, but the majority of the study is comprised of farmers and their spouses. Again, from Iowa and North Carolina, the majority of the cohort is white. As you would expect, the farmers are mostly men and the spouses are mostly women, although there are some female applicators as well. And the cohort was fairly young when they enrolled, and they're still fairly young, and they are well educated. So now I'll just dive into some of the overall cancer information that we have from the cohort. And we do this by comparing the rates in the farmers that we observed to the rates in the general population from those two states. So we use something called a standardized incidence ratio, or an SIR, to compare the rates with the general population. So if the SIR was 1, it would mean that the rates of the two groups are equal. And so if the rate is below 1, then farmers would have a deficit of cancer compared to the general population. And if the SIR is above 1, that means they would have an excess of cancer compared to the general population. So what we observed is something that we expected and that had been previously identified in historical studies of farmers, that overall they are healthier and their rates of cancer are lower than the general population. In particular, there were deficits for smoking-related cancers and for digestive-related cancers, which are like colorectal cancer, for which the main risk factor is physical activity. But there were some really interesting excesses. So one of the most compelling excesses was for prostate cancer. There are over 17,000 cases, or 1,700 rather, cases of prostate cancer in the study. And you can see that compared to their counterparts in the general population, farmers from the Ag Health study have more prostate cancer. There were some other interesting excesses of cancer that were observed in certain subgroups of the agricultural health study. So for example, there was an excess of ovarian cancer that was observed, but as I said, we have few female applicators and there were only 9 cases. So we have to continue to follow up on that to see if that will persist. There was also an excess of lip cancer among applicators from North Carolina, and we have hypothesized that might be related to the use of smokeless tobacco products, which is more common in North Carolina. We also found an excess of a subtype of lymphoma among the spouses. And again, we have, the numbers are small here, but we have hypothesized that this might be related to either pesticides or potentially other agricultural processes, maybe related to animals or animal viruses, but that's something that's of interest to follow up in the future. And another area that the agricultural health study is really following up on is an observed excess of multiple myeloma, which is a lymphatic disorder. And we've observed this significant excess in North Carolina applicators and also a significant excess of a precursor of multiple myeloma in the agricultural population. So as I said, one of the more compelling excesses based on a large number of people was the excess of prostate cancer. So my work has been really focused on trying to identify specific pesticides that might be related to that excess. So a little bit about the information that we've collected on pesticides in the study. At enrollment in the study, applicators were asked to provide information on 50 different pesticides that were common to the crops at that time. And this covers a wide range of different herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, and fumigants. And we have information on lifetime days, which is the number of years they used it and how many days they applied it over the course of their lifetime. We also have a wide range of additional information on things that might modify your exposure, including application method on the farm, application of pesticides to animals, mixing of pesticides, repairing equipment, and use of personal protective equipment, because all of these things will modify your exposure to pesticides. So what we observed, there are a lot of numbers on this slide, but the punchline is that we observed a significant association between the use of 3 organophosphate insecticides and risk of prostate cancer. So men who were heavy users of Phonophos, Turbophos, and malathion were 30 to 60% more likely to develop prostate cancer compared to those who didn't use those pesticides. And what was really interesting about this is that these 3 pesticides happen to belong to the same subchemical family of organophosphate insecticides. They're all organodithiophosphate insecticides, which my organic chemistry is a little rusty, but I'm pretty sure it means that there's 2 sulfur groups connected to the phosphate group. So it was just interesting to observe that the similarly structured pesticides were associated with an increased risk. Another thing that we were able to really focus on with prostate cancer was to look at aggressive forms of prostate cancer. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the recent controversy surrounding the utility of the PSA test to detect prostate cancer. So that test often identifies early, slow-growing types of prostate cancer, and it's unclear whether those cancers will ever kill you or become anything more serious. So what we did was we also considered prostate cancers that were either metastatic or lethal, and we found that these associations between these insecticides and these lethal and advanced forms of prostate cancer were much stronger. Another area of research of mine is combining the information that we know about genetics and prostate cancer. So really simplistically, we've been looking at these single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, which occur when a single nucleotide is replaced with another, that may have the potential to impact cancer development. And this is just your genetics, what you get from your parents. And we have this information because a large portion of applicators have provided a buccal cell sample, which is just a little swab from the inside cheek of their mouth, which we can use to identify various parts of their DNA that are of potential interest and combine that information with pesticide exposure to see if the two can jointly impact your risk for prostate cancer. So again, this is a pretty busy slide, but this is showing the relationship between joint exposure to the insecticides that I talked about before, and genetic contributors to prostate cancer. So for people who are highly exposed to Fonofos, Turbofos, and Malathion, those 3 organophosphate insecticides, and who carried these certain genetic susceptibilities, they were 2 and 3 times more likely to develop prostate cancer. So some of our results really are showing some promising leads for cancer and specific pesticides, especially for prostate cancer. But as you've heard maybe from other talks, for most pesticides, for cancer, this is really the largest study to date and one of the only studies that has prospectively evaluated specific pesticides as risk factors for cancer. But as with any study, we really have to continue to follow up on these results and reevaluate these associations as the cohort is continued as we continue to follow the cohort over time. And we are also continuing to analyze their genetic profile. So we have this genetic material, and we're constantly learning new things from the field of genetics that we can combine this information to maybe get a little better sense of what's going on for susceptible subgroups. So as I said, the cohort is continuing to be followed, and that is we have done several contacts over the course of the years where information on pesticide use is updated and continually collected, so we know over time the changing patterns of pesticide use. And of course, the cancer information is constantly being updated via the cancer registries. And the mean age of the cohort right now is about 60, and so cancer incidence tends to peak later on in life, and so I think there's going to be a lot we're going to learn in the next 10 to 20 years. So the other thing that we're really interested in thinking about doing in the future is evaluating pesticide combinations and mixtures. So up until this point, we've really focused on identifying risks associated with specific cancers, which is valuable because in the US, that's how they're regulated on a one-by-one basis. But we recognize that the reality is that farmers are exposed to multiple things at one time, and we have to try and think of novel analytic methods and statistical methods to see if we can combine this exposure information. And that's really challenging, but I think some more follow-up, and as the numbers grow in the cohort, we might be able to do those sorts of analyses. And I know we're talking about pesticides, but we have additional exposures that we're interested in studying, and we can always look at those as potential what we call confounders to see if they are really driving any of these associations, so we have a sense of how sure we are that the pesticides are driving these and not some other agricultural exposures. And there's a new effort in the agricultural health study called BIA. It's the Biomarkers of Exposure and Effect in Agricultural Study, where blood samples from 1,600 farmers are being collected. And the primary purpose of that effort is to follow up on some of the findings related to multiple myeloma. But having these blood samples will allow us to study several different hypotheses related to the mechanisms by which pesticides might cause cancer. So we're showing from the epidemiologic work that pesticides might be related to cancer, but we actually don't know how. And having these biological samples or blood will allow us to evaluate several markers in the blood that might be related to pesticide exposure. And I only briefly mentioned the spouses. We haven't focused any of the major analyses on the spouses yet, but many of them report using pesticides themselves, and many have bystander exposure. And so we are going to be moving on into studying the spouses and risk factors for cancer in the spouses in the agricultural health study as well. So these are all the collaborators in the various agencies associated with the agricultural health study. And of course today I work at the National Cancer Institute, and I've talked to you about cancer, but our sister organization at NIEHS, the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, is responsible for all the non-cancer related outcomes, including neurological problems and asthma, reproductive effects related to pesticide exposure. You can find a lot of this information on the agricultural health site, the agricultural health website if you Google it. And actually yesterday somebody asked me, like, where can I find this information? And I said, well, it's publicly available. All results that are derived from taxpayer dollars, which is funded by the National Institutes of Health, is free publicly for everybody to access. That was actually only a recent development in the last few years, so anybody can access this work. Thank you.